The waves gently broke on the sand as I arrived at White Shore Beach. The sky was clear, a typical summer morning in our quiet coastal town in New Zealand. I, Ryan McConnell, had been the chief of police for only 6 months, and I never imagined this day would change our community forever. I was checking on a few minor issues reported by the lifeguards when the screams began. First one, then several, rising in a growing wave of panic. I ran toward the commotion, feeling the sand slip through my fingers as I knelt beside a mutilated body at the water's edge. Blood stained the sea red, spreading in ever-widening circles. "Something huge got him," a trembling woman shouted, pointing toward the ocean. "White as snow. I've never seen anything like it." The terror in her eyes was real. All around, beachgoers rushed out of the water while others stood frozen, staring at the horizon as if expecting the monster to resurface at any moment. I tried to stay calm as I reached for my radio, calling for an ambulance and backup. The man before me was breathing heavily, a significant portion of his leg missing. I made a makeshift tourniquet with my belt, but I knew it was serious. Within hours, 2 more people were attacked. One of them did not survive. The beach, once filled with laughter and music, was now silent. Yellow ropes marking off restricted areas where forensic teams collected evidence. The smell of blood and salt water lingered in the air as I tried to organize witness statements. Most described the same thing. A massive white shape, far bigger than any shark ever seen in these waters. Some spoke of impossible lengths, 20 meters or more, numbers I attributed to panic and adrenaline. But even accounting for natural fear-induced exaggeration, something abnormally large was hunting in our waters. At the station, the atmosphere was tense. My team, used to handling occasional thefts and disturbances after parties, was now facing an unprecedented situation. The autopsy confirmed what terrified witnesses had described: giant bite marks, unlike those of any known predator in our waters. "It looks like a great white shark," the coroner said, "but much, much bigger. And the bite pattern, I've never seen anything like it." That was when Thomas Blackwood, a marine scientist who had recently moved to White Shore, knocked on the station door. His usually calm face was pale, and his hands, clutching a folder, trembled slightly. "You won't believe this, Ryan," he said, placing photos of bite marks on my desk. "These belong to a Carcharodon megalodon, a prehistoric shark that was supposed to have been extinct for over 2.5 million years. I looked at the photos, then at Thomas, certain he was joking. But his expression remained serious, his eyes reflecting the same disbelief I felt. "How is this possible?" I asked, staring at the images of massive fossilized teeth next to the wounds of our victims. The resemblance was undeniable. The marks lined up perfectly with the pattern of ancient fossils. "I don't know." Thomas ran a hand through his graying hair. "Maybe an isolated population survived in the deep sea. There's an ocean trench not far from here, unexplored, with depths that could hide unknown creatures. What's even more extraordinary is that witnesses describe an albino animal." "Albino? Like a great white shark?" "No, Ryan. Great whites aren't truly white, they're gray. We're talking about true albinism, a rare genetic condition. That would explain the snow-white coloration everyone mentioned." I spent the night wide awake, reviewing reports, researching megalodons online. Every new article I read deepened my concern. These creatures were apex predators of their time, capable of devouring whales. The thought of a monster like that lurking in our waters was terrifying. The next morning, I confronted Mayor Joseph Hamilton in his office. The window behind him perfectly framed the bay, where people continued to swim, unaware of the danger. Hamilton was a pragmatic man, more concerned with numbers and statistics than public safety. His impeccable suit and rehearsed smile concealed an ambition I knew all too well. "We need to close the beaches immediately," I demanded, throwing the reports onto his desk. "We've had 3 confirmed attacks in less than 24 hours. Whatever it is, it's big, and it's hungry." "Don't be absurd, Ryan," he replied, barely glancing at the documents. "We're at the height of tourist season. Closing the beaches would be catastrophic for our economy. Do you have any idea how much money flows into this town during this time?" His tone was condescending, as if I were a child frightened by shadows. 3 people have been attacked. One is dead. Another will likely lose a leg, I pressed, keeping my voice steady despite my rising anger. Accidents happen, he shrugged, finally picking up one of the reports. Maybe it was just a large, great white shark passing through. Nothing more. Witnesses saw something much bigger, I insisted. Thomas believes it could be a megalodon. The mayor laughed, a rough, humorless sound. An extinct sea dinosaur? Now you're being ridiculous. What's next? The Loch Ness Monster? Aliens? Put up some warning signs if you want, but the beaches stay open. I stormed out, knowing more lives would be lost. In the hallway, I ran into the mayor's secretary, a woman who had worked at City Hall for decades. He's always been like this, she said in a hushed voice. During the Great Storm of 2015, he refused to order evacuations until 3 houses were taken by the sea. He only understands the language of tragedy. Back at the station, I was determined to act with or without official support. I drafted a stern warning about the attacks and mobilized all available officers to patrol the beaches. It wasn't enough, I knew that, but it was better than nothing. The phone rang nonstop all day. Journalists wanted statements, worried locals sought reassurance, tourists canceled reservations. The tension in town was enormous, spreading like a virus. By the afternoon, I received a call from a hospital in Auckland. The second victim had died during surgery. Now there were 2 confirmed deaths, and the mayor remained unmoved. That's when I found Mason Takuta, a Maori fisherman who knew these waters better than anyone. He was on the docks, checking his nets and preparing his boat. Unlike the other fishermen who had decided to stay on land after the attacks, Mason seemed determined to head out. I heard what happened, he said in a deep voice. Do you believe it could be a megalodon? I asked, surprised by his acceptance of the impossible. The ancient Maori knew of creatures that Western science has only recently rediscovered, he replied cryptically. The ocean holds deeper secrets than we imagine. Would you help us find it? I asked, an idea forming in my mind. If we could prove the monster's existence, maybe we could force the mayor to take action. My boat is ready. We can leave at dawn. That night, as I prepared equipment for our improvised expedition, I received news of a third attack. A missing child, dragged into the sea before their parents' horrified eyes. The community was finally reacting, protesting outside City Hall and demanding the beaches be closed. But I knew it was too late for that family, and possibly for others, if we didn't act fast. The sun had not yet risen when I met Thomas and Mason at the dock. We loaded the boat with equipment, weapons, and fragile hopes. Our town depended on us now. The Kaitiaki, Guardian in Maori, was a sturdy fishing boat, but it felt far too small for the hunt we were about to embark on. Mason meticulously checked every part of the vessel, while Thomas organized his scientific equipment, a curious mix of cutting-edge technology and improvised tools. I brought tracking equipment and a special gun that fires traceable transmitters, Thomas explained, showing a device that looked like a cross between a harpoon and a rifle. I originally developed this for tracking whales, but the principles are the same. Will it work against something that big? I asked, doubting that any device designed for scientific research could stop a prehistoric predator. I don't know if a regular harpoon will work against something that size, Thomas admitted, adjusting the mechanism. But if we can attach a few trackers, we can monitor its movements and plan accordingly. At the very least, we'll know where it is. Mason called us aboard just as the first rays of sunlight began to illuminate the horizon. The sea was calm, almost ironic, considering the violence we knew lurked beneath its surface. As we pulled away from the coast, I glanced back at the beach. Despite all the warnings, people were already gathering on the sand. Human stubbornness never ceased to haunt me. Where exactly are we headed? I asked Mason, who steered the boat with the confidence of someone who knew every wave in these waters. There's a deep channel about 10 kilometers offshore, he replied, never taking his eyes off the horizon. Dolphins and smaller sharks often pass through there. If our creature is hunting, it'll likely use that route. Thomas calibrated the sonar, setting it to detect objects larger than 5 meters. The megalodon should be at least 15 meters long, he explained. If it's nearby, we'll know. On the first day, we saw nothing but dolphins and a few blue sharks. The sun was relentless, burning our skin despite the sunscreen. The initial tension gave way to monotonous waiting, interrupted only by occasional sonar alerts that always turned out to be false alarms. Maybe it left, I suggested as the sun began to set, more out of hope than conviction. Mason shook his head. It found easy food. It won't leave until the source is gone. We camped on the boat that night, taking turns keeping watch. The stars reflected on the water, creating the illusion that we were sailing through the sky itself. During my shift, I thought about the victims' families, about the weight of responsibility I felt for not being able to protect them. Every minute we spent without finding the creature meant more lives could be at risk. On the second day, we expanded our search. Thomas suggested heading farther south, following currents that might attract larger schools of fish. That was when we spotted a great white shark, a male, approximately 5 meters long. "Impressive," Thomas murmured, filming the animal. Under different circumstances, this would be the highlight of the expedition. But it was clear this wasn't our target, I added, watching how small the great white seemed compared to the descriptions of what we were hunting. Mason kept his distance from the predator, which soon lost interest in us and disappeared into the depths. We continued searching until nightfall, using bait and acoustic equipment that Thomas had brought to attract predators. Nothing worked. I was beginning to worry that we were chasing a ghost, that the bite marks on the victims might have another explanation. Then, on the third day, all hell broke loose. The morning began with a thick fog that limited our visibility to just a few meters. Mason navigated more slowly, relying more on his instincts than on the instruments. Thomas kept applying sunscreen, a nervous habit that revealed his growing anxiety. "Maybe we should try farther north," Thomas suggested. "There are historical reports of unusual sightings in that area." We were discussing the change of course when the sonar suddenly blared frantically. The sound cut through the mist like a fire alarm in a library. "Large object approaching," Thomas warned, his eyes wide as he stared at the monitor. "Very large. Moving fast." Mason immediately cut the engine. The sudden silence was oppressive, interrupted only by the sound of waves against the hull and the constant beeping of the sonar. My heart pounded so hard, I feared the creature might hear it. "Why did you stop?" I whispered. "Engines attract predators," Mason explained. "Sound, vibration, they sense it. Better to stay quiet and let it pass." We remained motionless, barely breathing, as the dot on the sonar crept toward the center of the screen, our position. Just when it seemed like it would pass alongside the boat, the dot changed direction. "It's coming for us," Thomas murmured. "There!" Mason suddenly shouted, pointing to a spot in the water. A few meters from the boat, a massive marble-white dorsal fin sliced through the surface, larger than any shark fin I had ever seen. It wasn't the typical triangular fin of a great white, but something more archaic in shape, as if it belonged to a different era. "My God," Thomas whispered, his voice trembling with fear. "An albino megalodon. This changes everything we know about evolution, extinction, genetic isolation." His words were cut short when something struck the boat from below, shaking us violently. I was thrown against the side of the boat, feeling the impact in my ribs. Mason was flung harder, his head colliding with the cabin with a sickening thud. He collapsed, a thin trail of blood running down his forehead. "Mason!" I shouted, crawling toward him as the boat rocked dangerously. Thomas grabbed his tracking equipment, struggling to keep his balance. "We have to tag the creature," he yelled. "Even if we can't kill it today, we need to track it." The largest of monsters, easily around 15 meters long, circled the kaitiaki slowly. Now that the fog had cleared slightly, I saw the creature clearly for the first time. Its skin wasn't truly white, but an eerie pale shade with bluish veins visible beneath the surface. Its eyes were small compared to the monstrous size of its body, but conveyed an ancient, relentless intelligence. It's beautiful," Thomas murmured despite the danger. "A perfect specimen. Perhaps the last of its kind." The megalodon took another slow lap around the boat, as if evaluating us. I checked Mason's vital signs. He was breathing, but still unconscious. Every second the creature didn't attack felt like an eternity. Thomas managed to position his tracking launcher, carefully aiming at the creature's back. "I only have one shot," he whispered. "I need to hit near the dorsal fin, where the skin is thickest. The tracker has to penetrate deep enough to stay in place." When the megalodon passed by again, Thomas fired. The tracker flew through the air and lodged into the creature's back. For a moment, the animal didn't react, continuing its predatory circle. Then, as if realizing the affront, its tail rose from the water. "Watch out!" I shouted, but it was too late. With a powerful strike of its tail, it slammed into the side of the boat, opening a breach in the hull. Cold water began rushing in immediately. The boat started tilting to one side, making every movement a challenge. "We're sinking!" I yelled, rushing to help Mason, who was still bleeding from his forehead. I dragged him to the highest part of the boat while Thomas tried to reach a metal case stuck under the bench. "The explosives," Thomas pointed to the case. "It was our last resort, but we have no choice." "Explosives? You brought explosives on a scientific mission?" "I came prepared for all eventualities," he replied, opening the case to reveal several compact packages. "I have a license for use in underwater seismic research. These are designed for controlled detonation underwater." As water flooded the boat faster, we prepared the explosives with trembling hands. Mason regained consciousness, but was visibly dizzy and confused. "What's going on?" he asked, trying to sit up. "We found your prehistoric shark," I replied, helping him stay steady. "And it doesn't seem too happy to meet us." The megalodon continued circling the sinking boat, occasionally nudging it as if testing our vulnerability. The water was already up to our knees, and the boat was tilting dangerously. "We only have one chance," Thomas said, connecting the detonators to the explosives. "We need to lure the monster close and detonate everything at once." "How do we do that?" I asked. "We're not exactly appetizing bait compared to a whale." Mason, still dizzy, pointed to the bucket of bloody bait we had brought to attract smaller sharks. "Blood. They can smell it for miles. That's how they find wounded prey." The idea was risky, but we didn't have many options. With the boat sinking, we began our last desperate move against a living relic of prehistory. We dumped the bait and blood around us, tying the explosives to improvised buoys. The red mixture spread through the water like ink, creating an enticing trail for any predator nearby. We watched, tense, as the megalodon, enraged by the scent, began approaching again. Thomas checked the detonators one last time, his hands trembling not just from the cold water now reaching our waists, but from the realization that we might be about to end the existence of the last creature of a species that had ruled the oceans for millions of years. The scientist in him battled against his survival instincts. "We have no choice," I murmured, reading the hesitation on his face. "If we don't stop it, more people will die." Mason, now more lucid, nodded grimly while preparing the lifeboat. Some creatures weren't meant to survive past their time. Its return is a disruption of the natural balance. The boat was sinking too fast now. With one final effort, we cast the explosive-laden buoys in a semicircle around the vessel. The megalodon, drawn by the scent of the bait, surged toward us, its massive white bulk cutting through the water like a bizarre submarine. "Now!" Thomas shouted. We jumped into the lifeboat, and I pressed the detonator the moment we reached what we hoped was a safe distance. The explosion was deafening, sending a column of water skyward that seemed to freeze for a moment before crashing down on us like a violent storm. The impact rocked our small boat, nearly capsizing it. Fragments of what appeared to be the prehistoric predator rained around us, chunks of flesh and white scales turning the water red. For a moment, we believed the nightmare was over. The sea seemed calm, only concentric ripples marking the blast site. "Did we do it?" Mason asked, staring at the water now murky with blood and debris. Thomas checked the device tracking the beacon. "I'm not getting a signal." The boat was violently lifted from the sea, cutting his words short. The megalodon, gravely wounded but far from dead, burst from beneath us, its massive jaws gaping, wider than the boat itself. I saw rows of triangular teeth, some larger than my hand, before our fragile refuge shattered. We were thrown into the air. When I hit the water, the impact knocked all the air from my lungs. Disoriented, I struggled to locate Thomas and Mason, but the water was cloudy, stained red. Something massive moved past me, so close I felt the water displacement shove me aside. I surfaced, gasping, desperately searching for my companions. I spotted Thomas a few meters away, clinging to a piece of the wrecked boat. But there was no sign of Mason. Then, a scream tore through the air. 20 meters away, I saw Mason being lifted partially out of the water, trapped between the monster's jaws. Our eyes met for a moment. I saw acceptance in his gaze before the megalodon pulled him under. Mason was gone in seconds, his scream quickly silenced by the relentless water. "Mason!" I screamed uselessly, swimming toward him on pure instinct, only to be stopped by Thomas. "We can't help him!" he shouted, gripping my arm. "He's gone, Ryan!" The reality of the situation hit me like a punch. I grabbed Thomas and swam frantically toward some floating wreckage from the Kaitiaki. The monster, now bleeding heavily from multiple wounds caused by the explosion, dove again, disappearing momentarily from sight. We reached a relatively large section of the deck that had broken off and was floating like an improvised raft. Climbing onto it, we gasped for air, shaking from both exhaustion and the horror of what we had witnessed. "Do you still have the last explosives?" I asked once I caught my breath. Thomas nodded, showing a small charge he had stored in a waterproof backpack strapped to his belt. Our last hope. It seemed insignificant compared to the size of the creature we were facing, but it was all we had left. "The tracker is still working," Thomas said, checking his device. "It's injured but alive, and it's circling us." I looked at the water, now clearer as the clouds of blood dispersed. There was no sign of the megalodon, but I knew it was there, waiting, perhaps temporarily satisfied by its last meal. The thought filled me with cold rage. Mason deserved more than to become food for a prehistoric monster. When the white fin cut through the water again, heading toward us, I made the hardest decision of my life. "Give me the explosives," I told Thomas. "Swim to that marker buoy ahead. I'm going to lure the monster away." "You won't survive," he protested, clutching the explosives. "It's suicide, Ryan. We should wait for rescue." "Rescue?" I laughed bitterly. "No one knows exactly where we are, and while we wait, that thing could head back to shore and kill more people." Thomas knew I was right. I could see it in his eyes. Reluctantly, he handed me the explosive charge. "Someone needs to get back and make sure the mayor shuts down those damn beaches," I added, checking the detonator, "and tell the truth about what happened here." We exchanged a brief hug. Thomas slipped back into the water and began swimming toward the buoy, about 100 meters away. I waited until he was at a safe distance before putting my desperate plan into action. I swam in the opposite direction, splashing the water and smearing a few drops of Mason's blood that had stained my shirt. It worked. The massive white shadow shifted course, coming for me at an astonishing speed for something so huge. The distance between us was closing fast. I prepared the explosives, mentally calculating the exact moment. I would only have one chance. If I detonated too early, the explosion wouldn't be strong enough. Too late, and I wouldn't live to press the button. When it opened its jaws, large enough to swallow a small car filled with triangular teeth, I threw the explosives directly into its throat and dove as deep as I could. The underwater explosion was muffled, but powerful enough to launch me several meters through the water, like a leaf in the wind. The pressure was crushing, compressing my lungs and making my ears explode with pain. I lost consciousness for a few seconds, maybe minutes. When I resurfaced, dizzy and almost breathless, fragments of flesh floated around me. The sea, once again, was red. The megalodon had literally been exploded from the inside out, its monstrous body reduced to unrecognizable chunks of meat. I don't clearly remember how I survived the following hours. At some point, Thomas returned with help. Apparently, he had managed to activate an emergency flare he was carrying. I vaguely remember being hoisted onto a rescue boat, hearing concerned voices, and the distant hum of a helicopter. Thomas and I came back as the only survivors. Mason's body was never found. The beaches were finally closed after our return, when I presented a detailed report to the city council along with the megalodon fragments we had brought as proof. Mayor Hamilton, embarrassed by his negligence that cost lives, including Mason's, resigned weeks later, unable to face the community's wrath. Scientists from around the world came to study the remains of the albino megalodon, astonished by its existence. Genetic tests confirmed that it was indeed a Carcharodon megalodon, although with some evolutionary adaptations that might explain its survival in deep waters. Albinism was real, a rare genetic mutation that would likely have been fatal under normal conditions, but may have offered some advantage in the dark depths where it had lived hidden for millennia. Thomas published several scientific papers on the discovery, becoming a celebrity in the field of marine biology. He turned down lucrative offers from prestigious universities, preferring to stay in Whiteshore to establish a research center dedicated to studying the unexplored depths near our coast. A team of researchers now constantly monitors our waters, equipped with cutting-edge technology inspired by the trackers Thomas had developed. So far, no other specimen has been found, but no one is willing to say for certain that the megalodon we killed was the last of its kind. As for me, I continue as police chief, though now with a scar on my right arm where one of the monster's teeth cut me during our final fight. Mason was right. Some creatures weren't meant to survive past their time, but I also learned another truth. As long as there are unexplored abysses on our planet, we can never say for sure what still exists in the shadows, waiting to emerge.